Good morning, Nick. Or evening. I mean, I assume you'll be watching this in the morning over there in France. It's evening here in California, but I thank you for bringing up this core issue of death. Core because it really does encompass the whole of life, because as you rightly pointed out, to understand what may or may not happen after we die, we kind of have to ask the question, um, what does it mean to be born? When do you, or your consciousness, your soul, your essence, when do you arrive on the scene? At what point in the development of the fetus and the birth of the infant do you become you? Because we assume at death that you is what will either transform or disappear or end. And I wanted to read a little bit, a tiny bit of a book, The Future of Psychology by Stanislav Grof, who is an adjunct professor at my school. He says, with a few exceptions, mental health professionals who have developed specific forms of psychological support and counseling for a large variety of emotional crises have given little attention to dying. Those facing the most profound of all imaginable crises, one that affects simultaneously the biological, emotional, interpersonal, social, philosophical, and spiritual aspects of the individual, remain the only ones for whom meaningful help is not available. A promising development in this regard is the growing network of hospices inspired by the pioneering work of Cicely Saunders that provide a warm human environment for the dying. All this occurs in the much larger context of collective denial of impermanence and mortality that characterizes Western industrial civilization. Much of our encounter with death is sanitized by teams of professionals who mitigate its immediate impact. In its extreme expression, it includes post-mortem barbers and hairdressers, tailors, makeup experts, and plastic surgeons who make a wide variety of cosmetic adjustments on the corpse before it is shown to relatives and friends. The media help create more distance from death by diluting it into empty statistics, reporting in a matter-of-fact way about the death of thousands of victims due to war, revolutions, and natural catastrophes. Movies and TV shows further trivialize death by capitalizing on violence. They anesthetize modern audiences against its emotional relevance by exposing them to countless scenes of dying, killing, and murder in the context of entertainment. In general, the conditions of life existing in modern technological countries do not offer much ideological or psychological support for people who are facing death. This contrasts very sharply with the situation encountered by those dying in one of the ancient and pre-industrial societies. Their cosmologies, philosophies, mythologies, as well as spiritual and ritual life, contain a clear message that death is not the absolute and irrevocable end of everything. They provide assurance for the dying that life or existence continues in some form beyond the biological demise. Eschatological mythologies are in general agreement that the soul of the deceased undergoes a complex series of adventures in consciousness. The posthumous journey of the soul is sometimes described as a travel through fantastic landscapes that bear some similarity to those on Earth, other times as encounters with various archetypal beings, or as moving through a sequence of holotropic states of consciousness. In some cultures, the soul reaches a temporary realm in the beyond, such as the Christian purgatory or the lokas of Tibetan Buddhism. In others, an eternal abode, heaven, hell, paradise, or the sun realm. Many cultures have independently developed a belief system in metempsychosis or reincarnation that includes return of the unit of consciousness to another physical lifetime on Earth. Pre-industrial societies all seem to agree that death was not the ultimate defeat and end of everything, but an important transition. The experiences associated with death were seen as visits to important dimensions of reality that deserve to be experienced, studied, and carefully mapped. The dying were familiar with the eschatological cartographies of their cultures, whether these were shamanic maps of the funeral landscapes or sophisticated descriptions of the Eastern spiritual systems, such as those found in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. This important text of Tibetan Buddhism represents an interesting counterpoint to the exclusive pragmatic emphasis on productive life and denial of death characterizing Western civilization. It describes the time of death as a unique opportunity for spiritual liberation from the cycles of death and rebirth, or, in the event that we do not achieve liberation, a period that determines the nature of our next incarnation. In this context, it is possible to see the intermediate states between lives, what the Tibetans call bardos, as being in a way more important than incarnate existence. It is then essential to prepare for this time by systematic spiritual practice during our lifetime. So, for some reason, in our modern Western industrialized civilization, as Groff says, we have this great fear of death because we assume that what we are is somehow dependent on this material body. Maybe that's a warranted assumption, but we should probably ask why it is that only in the last few hundred years have human beings, a particular culture of human beings, come to the conclusion that death is the ultimate end. What is it that makes us assume that's the case? Well, I suppose it is our philosophical belief in materialism, that basically there is no such thing as consciousness. All that there is a material body, which is born, develops, and then dies. And, we talk about cultures in the past in a kind of condescending way, as though, they didn't know about the true nature of reality. They didn't have science. They didn't care about the truth. They just had these, religious beliefs and so forth. But I think whatever we say about what happens after death is inevitably going to be some form of belief. But then on the other hand, in such texts as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, apparently over the course of, centuries, these accomplished meditators have developed a sort of instruction manual for how to die in the most productive and potentially rewarding way possible. And whether or not we believe that that is even possible, I think we kind of have to respect the fact that we don't know. At the very least, we don't know. But on the other hand, when you think of it in the terms that you're thinking of it, Nick, in the sense that before we can talk about what happens after death, we have to understand what happens at birth. You come to see how mysterious this process really is. Because, at what point do you become you? At what point does an infant wake up and become conscious as this identity which can and will eventually die? What is it that dies? What is it that's born? These are fundamental questions that I really don't have a way of articulating an answer for. But it's the kind of mystery that I think we have to sit with and not rush to judgment about. And I think what Groff is pointing out, that the tremendous fear of death in our modern industrial, scientific, materialistic culture is rather destructive, because it makes us a little bit too consumptive and selfish in this life, because we think it's all that we have and it doesn't matter what happens after.